So good evening, everybody, and thanks very much for coming out on this cold, almost wintry Sydney evening. It's our pleasure to introduce this session on collaborative documentary filmmaking organised by Rowena. Firstly, paying deep respects to the traditional custodians of this land, past, present and future, the Bidjigal people. And I'd like to say actually, just as a local person living here at the moment, that just only 1 kilometre away from this very site of this talk this evening, 20,000 artefacts are being brutally dug up by the government without a proper survey, and the traditional owners are not happy about that. So I'd like to say sorry on behalf of local community to those people whose rights, again, are basically being trampled on by government without any due respect. So anyway, thank you very much for joining the session. This is a session organised by OzDox. OzDox has monthly meetings. It's a terrific organisation, national organisation for promoting documentary culture, in collaboration with Australian Directors Guild and AFTRS, Australian Film, Television and Radio School. So we have also a newsletter, so please tune into the website and check out what's going on regularly. Okay, and without further ado, I'll pass you over to Rowena, who's coordinated this.
Hi everyone, I'm Rowena Potts. I'm a documentary filmmaker and a PhD student in anthropology from New York University, and I'm really excited to see everyone here. We have a really fantastic, diverse lineup of speakers tonight, all of whom will be speaking about and reflecting on a range of different collaborative documentary projects, both contemporary and historical, which I hope will extend and provoke the way we think about collaboration and documentary as categories in the first place. So just a little background about me. My own interest in collaborative and participatory documentary filmmaking was generated during the course of my studies at NYU, and it's something I've become more interested in since I first participated in a collaborative project that was organized and run by David McDougall, who's a visual anthropologist at ANU. That involved working with 4 11-year-old girls in Calcutta, India. What the experience confirmed for me is that as a principle, I'm interested in a filmmaking process that is inclusive and in films that are made with people, not about subjects. It also raised a lot of questions in my mind about collaboration as a filmmaking methodology. How does it work and when does it work? What are the ideas or goals that motivate or provoke projects that we might define as collaborative or participatory? What kinds of disjunctures arise between those goals, the process, and the final outcome? How do we balance collaborative filmmaking as a process with formal or aesthetic considerations of filmmaking? How do we generate sustainable institutional support for these kinds of projects where process is weighted more heavily than product? So these are just some of the questions that I've been thinking about, and I thought that a good way to keep thinking about them was to invite these fantastic people to speak about it. Our first speaker is Willi Lempert, who's a colleague of mine in anthropology, and who I just had the opportunity of spending 2 weeks with in a remote community in Western Australia called Balgo. Willi Lempert is a PhD candidate in cultural anthropology from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He recently completed his 4th and primary research trip of 20 months to the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, where he collaborated with Indigenous media organizations to follow the social life cycles of their film productions. So I'm going to hand over to Willi now. Willi, it's great to see you. Thanks for being part of this.
So you should see me full screen. I'll just do a screen sharing, so now you know what I look like, but you should be able to see, in theory, my presentation. Is that working?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm very pleased to join you overseas through the use of technology. And before starting, I'd also like to acknowledge traditional owners on the land in which you are meeting and which I am sitting as well in Colorado, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. And just so you know, the Sydney sunset tweet went viral and it's all over people's Facebook pages in the States. So that was a nice connection to Sydney, where I was yesterday. So I'm particularly excited to present here through technology especially because I was just working with Rowena, and I want to give a shout out to Clint Dixon if he happens to be in the audience.
He is.
Oh, hi, Clint. He was also on the shoot, and I'll come back to that project toward the end of this discussion. And so I wish I could see the other talks on the panel. Maybe there's a way if they're recorded. So I hope mine will connect in some meaningful way with the other ones. Um, and just to repeat what Rowena said, a little bit about myself. My name is Willi. I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology from the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I recently completed 20 months of primary fieldwork where I collaborated on a variety of film projects with indigenous media organizations in the Kimberley, which you all know where that is, of course. And so by recently completed, I mean I got home 24 hours ago after a 2-day, 5-flight journey from Broome. Rowena was very nice to let me stay at their place on my layover. And so while it's 3 a.m. where I am, I'm actually still on WA time. So to me, it feels like late afternoon. And so I see my talk as not presenting conclusions, but it's more of a first step in beginning an ongoing conversation as I'm at the starting point of writing and will continue for the next year. And I encourage a lot of feedback, and I hope there's a little bit of time for discussion and a question or two. And so quickly, I'd like to thank the people who funded my project. So not only the Australian American Fulbright Commission, but also the Wintergren Foundation. I'd also like to thank Nolangu Research Institute, which is up in Broome, and they're a great small Indigenous research institute that's at Notre Dame in Broome. And as a quick warning, I'll be showing images of elders in my presentation, mostly from Balgo, so I wanted to make sure that the audience knows that before I begin. And I'll show several, or actually 3 very short clip excerpts to keep it dynamic, and hopefully they'll work well enough over Skype to get the general idea, even if it's not perfect. And so, I'm very pleased to discuss collaboration. It's something I have thought deeply about in terms of my own project, and especially in relation to other anthropologists and filmmakers. It's a concept that is much discussed in anthropology especially, but it's not always well defined, as I'm sure other speakers will discuss after me. And it often leads to as many questions as it does answers. For example, is it simply about some level of mutual involvement? And aren't all films collaborative since they involve so many people working with each other? And how involved do really various people need to be to qualify for this category of collaborative in particular? So at its core, my talk is about thinking through what this concept has, does, should, and could mean. And so I want to just make 2 points which at first might seem contradictory. So on the one hand, I suggest that to label films as collaborative, a crucial basis for this distinction has to do with the co-elaboration of film's vision throughout that process. And so I'll come back to that idea, but really elaborating together. And 2, on the other hand, I argue that successful collaboration also has to do with knowing when not to collaborate on certain elements of the film process. So I spend the bulk of this talk trying to engage these 2 points in relation to sort of drawing from the dozens of projects I was able to work with over the past couple of years. And while I worked on many projects in Broome, which is really certainly not a remote community, and it's a small town that many of you may have been to, I'm going to focus for clarity and just having a coherent 15-minute talk on the projects in Balgo and a couple other remote communities in particular, since it's a very particular type of collaborative work environment. So very, very briefly, I think it's important to understand where I'm coming from, just at a very basic level, before I get into what I'm on about. So, luckily, as collaboration, of course, hinges on long-term relationships, I've been fortunate to be able to foster relationships in the Kimberley over a number of years. So through serendipity, I volunteered at Galari in 2006, over 10 years now. And during my master's project, when I went back home, I volunteered with a variety of Native American film festivals and chatted with people and wrote about Native American science fiction films. But I had a film professor who said something quite obvious, and he said, if you want to talk about other people's films, try making one. It'll change the way you think about it. And I thought that was pretty sensible. So I took a film class, and when I went back to school for a PhD, I decided I wanted to go back to Broome and try to do collaborative filmmaking with Galari and Packham, 2 organizations there, who I knew previously. So I had the luxury of going back in 2012 and just chatting, just seeing what people thought, getting good feedback, coming back the next year, doing a couple more projects, chatting, and then going to Balgo for a couple projects, and spending some time in Nukumba on my own where I didn't know anyone, and that was another kind of experience. So my final trip, as Rowena mentioned, was 20 months of primary fieldwork with Galari and Packham, and I was able to be involved in over 30 projects, not all of them deeply, but as two production companies, there were a lot of projects passing through them all the time. So moving through, my project is really about the social life of media. It's about process, and it's essentially about following films through a whole system, and not just focusing on the final product, but really every element of the process from bureaucracy to grants to budgets, infrastructure, pre-production, production, post-production, circulation, media festivals that we went to, as well as the sort of everyday stuff, the debates, the setbacks, the moments of excitement, and also sort of moments of daily boredom, which is a real part of any kind of long process. And there are just a lot of ethical reasons that I suppose more relevant for anthropology I felt was good about filmmaking, including not having to ask a lot of questions, having an actual role and being able to contribute in a daily way, and also contributing to broad audiences, not just journal articles buried in the back of libraries written for a few, which not many people are really engaged with. So for all those reasons, I was really interested in doing a project around collaborative media. And so the primary project that many of the projects, especially in Balgo, led up to and followed from was Jawa Jawa. And so Jawa Jawa was one of the 10 Screen Australia NITV Songlines on Screen grants, which, as many of you probably know, is the first big investment by Screen Australia for this type of project. And it was a whole, I'll come back to the idea of the sort of bush circus, but it was over 40 people around a week's journey, lots of cameras, and I worked on a film the year before that. And I was just sort of assisting where needed. And while it was never my intention to become a filmmaker in any way, I did try before this main fieldwork trip to just get the basic fundamental skills so that in any position I wouldn't be a weak link or dead weight. And so this was a real quick learning curve to see a big production like this happen and get to know people in Balgo. And all the projects I'll talk about later on really come out of just me being lucky enough to be included on this trip. And so we'll see how this goes. I'll just show you the first 40 seconds or so of Jawa Jawa, and you can let me know if it's sort of working well enough.
Maja cukur punang baja mane ngayon aja bangali purongo. Orang cukur punang wajar ko. Yani ya ir magal bajano. Tojo. Pondo bada binina ma ir magal bajano.
So that's a very quick introduction to give you a sense of that kind of project, and that was sort of the biggest project I was a small part of. And so I'd like to just set up this model to discuss collaboration based on a really simple question around what makes remote collaborative film projects succeed, in particular with relative outsiders such as myself who haven't lived there their whole life or don't know people at a really deep level. So there's a vast amount of research, there's all sorts of discussions academics talk about, but to me it was important to get into the very core question of what goes well, and we'll just quickly define succeed as having good feeling of success in the process and the product by people in the community, by the regional production company, and by the national funders if there are any, and the national broadcasters, whether it's ICTV or NITV or ABC or anyone else. So the projects that really are successful up and down in process and result. Yeah, so I'm very aware of time, so I'll try to quickly get through this model. Essentially, there's three themes that I noticed that came out of these years of work, and I'll outline what they are very quickly, and then try to discuss how thinking through things in this model might help rethink, in a way, collaboration in each particular one. So creative bushfires, and thinking about creativity in communities, I kept coming back to the idea of the bushfire. We set a lot of them, and like much of the creative moments that happen with projects I was involved with, they happen at the right time, with the sort of weight, and they burn quickly. They travel fast, and then they're done. And if you've missed it, there's no take two. It's happened. And I just thought this really related well to so many things I was involved with. For example, when I was in Balgo for 3 months, we set up this recording studio, and a month passed, and we were kind of waiting to see if people were interested, chatting. And then one day, it was just 12 hours, and then 8 hours every single day. And there's dozens of examples I could give where kind of waiting, and then it happened. And for an outsider like me, there's three elements that I noticed that had really to do with patience, waiting for the right time, as well as slowly building relationships, maybe the most important one, and having a lack of sort of pressure, no pushiness. But at a deeper level, I think the language is important because many outsiders, in a variety of ways, regularly kind of whisper about work ethic and laziness. And I just feel strongly that it's important to dispel those assumptions. Because, of course, what's really going on is misunderstanding the social obligations people have, as well as the productive rhythms of creativity in communities, which have nothing to do with the 9-to-5 workday. So infrastructure, this one is the physical stuff: vehicles, fuel, cameras, food, water, bush supplies. And it's a bit less metaphorical. As Clint knows, in the Jawa Jawa trip in particular, basically every bush trip I went on, the limiting factor was never water, fighting, food. It was always tires, every single time, and tire politics. And we ended up making it way out of the way just to get a tire when we were sort of one tire away from a sticky situation. And it's important to separate this from paperwork and bureaucracy. I think, in broad strokes, for the sake of time, I might note that community members are very good at tires. Not just bush mechanics, but everything around the sort of physical stuff, and people are right on the cameras and that kind of thing. I think paperwork distinction is really important as well. And it's the least metaphorical of all. It has to do with money and grants. Money's tricky for a variety of reasons we won't get into at the moment. Timesheets, film waivers, and driver's licenses. That's a whole discussion in itself. And the reason I went to Balgo in the first place is because what I had to offer was a driver's license. So I was definitely the worst driver, but just up past Tahal's Creek, I could drive legally, and then the actual good drivers took over. So the bureaucracy is a whole kind of thing we can get into. But for the sake of trying to stay in time, I really like to focus in particular on just a few things about fires, paper, and tires. So just gotta say, I'm sort of running to the end. I think a really key sort of advice around fires, paper, and tires is that there's a sort of paradox in that you might think the limiting factor is money in these projects, but in almost every situation, the limiting factor is just not putting out the fires. In many projects, there's a lot of paper, there's a lot of tires, and the easiest thing to do is sort of squash the creativity. And there's this sort of paradox. So I guess quick advice that comes to mind for me around fires is that you really, in these situations, you want to. The pressure thing is really important. I think a good example, just to maybe because I see I'm sort of down to 1 minute, I'd just like to discuss.
Take your time, Willi. It's okay.
We're not in too big of a hurry.
It's okay. Go for it.
I think a good example to illustrate what I'm talking about is I'll show you this really short clip of this hand sign film that we made, or that I made with these old women in Balgo. And this is the most chaotic film. We just made it sort of quite in the moment, in the most unpredictable time you could imagine, and that's a long story. And it was just sitting down, it came out of joking around hand signs. But there were a couple magic moments that came out of it, which is what these three things sort of lead into. And so that's just a really quick example. And then we made that just for fun. And against all odds, it got picked up by NITV at the National Remote Indigenous Media Festival in Lajamanu. And they asked us if we would make a half hour. And so this really put the Fires, Tires paper to the test. Because it's sort of easy enough to do when you have months to sit down and be very patient, and you have no one sort of expecting particular outcomes. You have a troopy, you have purchase orders to go bush. But I think more useful for this audience is that's not how films work. You have a production, you have expectations, you have production values, you have all sorts of constraints around time and people coming in. So I just wanted to briefly discuss how this plays out in a more typical situation for people who are in the business of making films. And so one thing I would point out about the fires that I think is very difficult is, or just to backtrack for a second, just to do a 1 week shoot, I thought the fastest that could be done is 1 week with Peckham, just setting things up, and then 2 weeks of just one person going ahead, sitting down, making sure everything was going to be good with the film, creating excitement, trying to foster some fires, trying to include lots and lots of people, and having some sense of the politics involved. And then filming all the sort of intimate moments, like with that last film. There's certain shots that are just so much better with one or two people and the people you're working with, in my experience. And then having a plan for the sort of 5-day, big money, film crew, the circus, as they say. And then having 1 week just to hang out afterwards, leaving someone back to make sure that everything actually went properly, that everyone got paid in the right way, that nothing happened that shouldn't have happened, that would have been easy to miss in the circus. And so just around sort of tires, fires, paper, quickly with this shoot, the tire politics happened right away. Before I got there, I got a phone call and that there were tire issues. And so the old Packham Troopy that you see on the right there, when I got there, it had no brakes, no spare, and a borrowed tire we had to return right away. And so without getting into the details, this kind of situation was one in which having good relationships with local bush mechanics was the difference between doing the film and not doing the film. And as far as paper, there were a lot of things to sort of organize before and after, make sure it went well, especially around money consideration. And just making sure that people are not just paid for the hours they work, but their contribution, which is very subjective and has to do with often cultural knowledge people are bringing to the table. For example, the person who sort of sat down and recorded over 300 hand signs with us. And the final main point is that there's a paradox, I think, of control that goes through all of these issues, and which is about letting go. So several times in the shoots, we had everything set up. There's kind of a lot of pressure because we had the whole film crew, and there were key shots. And one of the main people maybe said, for whatever reason, I want to go home, or I don't want to do this. And so for me, the key thing in every one of those situations was say, just that's fine. It's not a problem at all. And what I've noticed, one is, it's just how I feel, that if people don't want to do it, the film's not the most important thing, which is not always easy to say. But the more relevant issue is that in basically every single situation, I think if people felt like they were able to easily exert control over the process and stop the shoot, there's never an important moment where people didn't immediately say, okay, let's actually do it. It's fine. So I think people are really paying attention to see what your priorities are and whether they have control over what's happening. So just as a really final point, 'cause I don't want to go too over, is I think there's these subjective elements that are really tricky to put into things like Indigenous Advancement Strategy grants, which is how the Indigenous sector works, or in film grants in general. The Songlines program is quite good at this. But just generally speaking, I think for me, trying to create a language that's based locally that would make sense to people in Balgo, but tries to reframe some of these things around valuing certain organizations, especially Indigenous media organizations, in their ability to do these things, is really important because it's sort of incommensurable with the way grants work, with numbers and outcomes and that type of thing. And for Indigenous media organizations, everything that I've said is sort of painfully obvious because that's the stuff they live and breathe, and they have all those relationships and sensibilities. So I see that I'm at 20 minutes, so I better stop now. But thank you for having me, and if there's time for a question or perhaps not, it's a pleasure to quickly Skype in.
Thank you, Willi. If there are any questions, I just want to encourage people to go to the microphone in order to ask Willi.
Did he make a film? Did he end up finishing a film?
We did, yeah. For the most recent one about hand signs. And it went really well in the end. So I think the model worked fairly well. And the way that we sort of did it was sort of two films. On the one hand, we sat down and did these multicams with just one or two people and elders for something substantial for the community for the future. So just a visual dictionary of hand signs translated into language, something that grandkids and great-grandkids might really appreciate. And then on the other hand, we did the sort of 1 week shoot of high production value stuff. We used the really nice camera that was bought for Jawa Jawa, and Clint had all these amazing close-ups, long exposures. So I think we were able to juggle the expectations of NITV with what local people might appreciate in the long term. And another thing to mention about this, and this also had to do with my limitation as not a professional director, we divided everything up into very tiny skits, sort of organized around this drive-in movie so that each little skit could be just projected on the drive-in in the film, so that anyone could be involved, even if they just had a very tiny idea that didn't relate to the rest of the film. Just really trying to structure it so that there was very little limitation on these sort of creative fires that could take off in any direction, so that we weren't worried about the structure of the film, and we're able to kind of have a bit of a jazz improvisation attitude about it. So I don't want to speak too soon. The editing has to happen, but I think we got it. Something that NITV will be happy with, and people in Balgo will as well.
I think there's one more
Thank
question.
you. I'd say all documentaries jazz, but then I don't know anything.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I really believe that too. It was a great exercise with NITV to sort of have all this structure and everything else. But the sort of letting go of control and letting where things go in a direction, I think, is where when the magic happens. And I suppose for I'm in the world of nerdy anthropologists, and so it's maybe a revelation. But for the filmmakers in the audience, it's probably a very obvious point that you go with the story, and the story takes you on a journey.
Thank you so much, Willi. Thanks for being
Thank you.
here. Thanks for staying up late and sharing your presentation and thoughts and experience.
I hope I didn't distract your schedule too much.
And we'll talk soon.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Well, now we're going to move on to our next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Mike Rubbo, a documentary filmmaker. Mike Rubbo was born in 1938 in Melbourne. He did an honors degree in anthropology at Sydney University, and then he went to Stanford to do a master's in communication. From there, he went to the National Film Board of Canada, where he worked from 1965 till 1995. And we're really lucky to have Mike here speaking to us today about the Challenge for Change program that was initiated by the National Film Board of Canada. And I welcome Mike to the floor.
I asked them if I could prance around because I thought I could practice for TED Talks. Not that I've been asked to give one, but I thought it's something one should be ready to do. So I don't know whether to pronounce or not. But I'd like you to picture this situation. Southern Georgia, mid-30s, US, and a man is lacing up a projector. He's thin, he's got little round glasses, and he could be an accountant except for his sort of costermonger hat. This is George Stoney, and he's working for the Farm Administration, and he's going around the US in the mid-30s in the Roosevelt era, probably the most progressive time in America ever, and he's showing an amazing film called The River. Now, I don't know if you've seen The River. I refreshed my memory of this wonderful film made by Per Lorentz, made through an organization which came closest in the US to what the National Film Board of Canada was. In other words, it's almost the only time they ever got close to something like that. And I'm going to indulge you just. The film is 3 elements. It's music, a wonderful music track. It's images, of course, and it's a voice of God narration. And as we're learning about the system of the river, which is the Mississippi, the voice says, down the Yellowstone, down the Milk, the White and the Cheyenne, down the Cannonball, the Mussel Shell, the James and the Sioux, down the Wachita, the Wichita, the Red and the Yazoo, down to the Gulf go the great rivers. And it sets up this wonderful poetic inevitability of how this river has been destroyed by all the clear cutting along its banks. Anyway, I think it's the first great ecological film. Now, what the hell has that got to do with collaborative filmmaking? Probably nothing at all, except the man who was showing that became one of the most important figures in the collaborative challenge for change ethos. And he got into film because of that experience. He had no intention of being a filmmaker, but he saw the power of that film to move people and to have its impact. And he decided that this is something that he was going to devote his life to. So if we go 30 years further forward, George will be in his 50s by now, and he'll end up at the National Film Board just at the time that this program called Challenge for Change was being set up, and he's going to be the executive producer there. At the same time, we have to think about the context. As I said, America was in a progressive mode, and Canada in the 60s was also very progressive. Pierre Trudeau was the Prime Minister, and there was a sort of empathy and compassion in the country, which I think is Canada's actual natural state, a state that it hasn't been in recent years. But now, interestingly enough, of course, that man's son, Justin Trudeau, is Prime Minister. So we'll see what happens. Yes. So fast forward 30 years, just before George arrives at the film board, Colin Lowe is sent off to Fogo Island. The government has actually asked the film board to address poverty. Imagine that, a government asking you to do something like that. They've asked the film board to do this, and he goes off to Fogo Island, which is this wind-swept rock sitting in a terrible, tumultuous wild North Atlantic Sea, and it's 14 k's by 24 k's, and it's got 10 little villages around it. They don't call them villages, they call them outports. And they're so remote and isolated, even from each other, that people in one village don't know the people in the next village. The only way to get from village to village is by boat, and they don't bother, because their whole raison d'etre is going for the cod. But the cod are dying out. The whole thing is collapsing. And the plan of the government is to move all the people off Fogo Island and take them to the mainland. Colin gets there, and Colin could have done a poetic, nostalgic end of an era film. In fact, he'd done that film with that classic City of Gold, which you may know. The most wonderful film about the Yukon gold rush in the 1890s. A heavily narrated film, but made out of a superb set of stills that were found. Colin could have done that, but he didn't. He actually started this Challenge for Change process by filming collaboratively with these island people who felt themselves to be totally inarticulate. And of course he had to say, no, you're not. You have a story to tell and you're telling it wonderfully. And having got them on film, he then took the film from village to village. So people who had never seen each other started to see that they had similar perceptions of what should happen to the island and that they should perhaps work together. So he was like a postman in a way with film, and he was going around from place to place and made 27 little films that were bicycled, although there was no bikes because there were no roads, but taken by boat around and cemented a sort of solidarity to the island that led to them building a fish processing plant and, in fact, cancelled all plans to take the 2,000 people who were on that island off. So, in a sense, I think it was a great early success for Challenge for Change. And it had its poetic side because the place was so extreme and so strange and so classically beautiful. In preparing for this talk, I went online and had a look at Fogo Island. I advise you to do the same. It's somewhere that I want to go. Anyway, so there was Colin coming back from this Fogo experience. George Stoney is arriving, 68, towards Christmas. And one of the first things that happens, there's a Indian film group, Native American Indian film group, who are being trained at the film board in the Challenge for Change program. And the charismatic leader of that group is a guy called Mike Mitchell. George gets a phone call from Mike saying, I'm down at the reserve, which was a large Mohawk reserve that straddled the US-American Canadian border and the two states of Ontario and Quebec. And he was down there at this Christmas time, and there was a revolt brewing. What had happened was that the native peoples had the right, traditionally, by treaty, to move across this white man's border free of hindrance. And suddenly the Canadian government and the Americans had got together and said, we're going to put up a customs barrier here, and we're going to charge people money. If they buy something in one place, they'll have to pay taxes, duty on it to take it over. Well, they were furious, as you can imagine. Mike Mitchell said, George, can you get a film crew down here tomorrow? Stoney, not knowing what the rules of the film board were and how things are supposed to be done, went up into the cafeteria, muscled up a film crew, and had them on the road within an hour or two. And down they were, filming the process of what these people would do the next day. And the next day, they started their protest involving the International Bridge, and it started to hit the media and it started to get violent. And what the NFB filmmakers, under the direction of the Indian participants themselves, it was they were calling the shots on the filmmaking, unlike the mainstream media who came in and suddenly, of course, zeroed with lascivious glee on the violent elements. And they were recording how, in fact, the mainstream media was inciting this situation. And then it got very complicated because there were various factions that split within the Indian group as to whether they should go that way further, to take the confrontation further, or whether they should back off. And then all of that got filmed. And the rushes were rushed back to the film board. Another phone call from Mike, who was still there or just getting out of jail, saying, George, we have to have those rushes synced up by tomorrow and back down here with a Siemens multi-head projector so we can show it to the community, because people are starting to accuse each other and the whole thing is going very bad. And he said, I bet you that we have on film stuff which will show people how the process evolved, and it will build trust. And somehow, the film board was closing down for Christmas, but somehow George got that material synced up with somebody's help, and it was all sort of assembled in chronological order on the reels, taken back down to the community, shown there in public screenings, and had what Mike hoped, the desired effect. It calmed the whole thing down. So whereas the other media had been inflaming the situation, this Challenge for Change media effort actually acted as a great calming effect on the situation, and it was finally resolved according to the wishes of the local people. The whole idea of the impost and the tax and the border control was dropped. So that was very exciting. Now, I was just there all through this time. I knew George, he was a friend. Later, he would always invite me to when he was teaching at NYU, he would invite me there. But I wasn't really a participant, and I'm not quite sure why. Because of all my friends, it was something that I think I should have been involved in. And I had my own battles at that time, because I was making observational type of documentaries, and I was doing the indecent thing of making myself part of the story. Not because I really wanted to, but because I believed that the whole business of fly on the wall was bullshit, that you really were never a fly on the wall, that you were always and somehow influencing events. And I was fighting that battle, and I was not very popular at the film board for doing that, because my films were not getting shown on TV. They were all being rejected because of this intervention of the filmmaker. But George thought I was absolutely on the right track. But anyway, so for some reason I wasn't completely involved, but I did see a second friend of mine, Bonnie Scher-Klein, who had been my colleague and student at Stanford. We were there together, and she'd arrived at the film board, and she was picking up on what George was doing and saying, the problem is the cumbersome equipment. We can't give film to people when they can't run the cameras. It's all too complex. And at that time, providentially arrived the Portapack. It was very crude and clumsy. It was a camera. There it is. I'd forgotten we got images. Did you see George, by the way, on the screen? Oh, good. You saw George young, looking like the accountant with his little hat on. And you saw George he died at 95 in 2012. And I think that colour shot of him was probably fairly close to the end. He was at the Occupy demonstrations in New York. So there's Bonnie on the left and in the middle. And this is the sort of Portapack that appeared, Sony, as you see. And what they did with those was this community of Saint-Jacques, which was a poor part of Montreal. The inciting incident was the fact that they didn't have any community health clinic. This is before Medicare, and there was a desperate need for a clinic, and so one got set up by a volunteer situation by doctors and nurses. And so that became the focus for this community committee and action. And then this got plugged into it. This equipment got plugged in. And the people themselves took the equipment and they took it into the streets, as you see here. And they interviewed people on the streets. So what do you think we should do? How should we handle the situation in French? And what they found was very, very good was that people, it was so unusual then to be filmed. It was such an exceptional event. You know, nobody ever got on film or on video. And so by announcing the fact that these videos from the street would be shown at the next meeting, at the beginning of the next meeting, the meetings were packed as people came to see themselves and subsequently joined up. And so all of that worked relatively well, I think. Dorothy Haino, who supplied me with wonderful notes for this talk and also comes into the story as a very important figure, and that's Dorothy Young, and this is Dorothy Moore today. She said, it only works if there's something there, if it's only if there's latent elements that want this to happen. is the equipment useful, and will it, play a role? And at the same time, the filmmakers like Dorothy and Bonnie, there was a certain torn thing, because they are filmmakers, and giving over the equipment to somebody else is all fine in principle, but what about oneself and one's film-making talents, And so always there became a film out of it. There was a film called VTR Saint-Jacques, which was the overview made by Bonnie Klein about those events and so on. And that helped to spread to a far wider audience the story of Challenge for Change and the process. And I think, that was very, very important to do, because without that other thing, it wouldn't have amplified itself. At the same time, after George was at the film board for 2 years, he went back to the States and he worked on setting up cable television stations, or getting access to cable television stations for this type of programming. And he was very effective in doing that, because that was the next phase, to get material onto cable. So that's about all that I know about it. What happened after that, I don't know. I was thinking to myself, isn't it strange? I live at Avoca Beach, and I am the editor of the newsletter of the Avoca Beach Community Association. And guess what? It never occurred to me that we could use media in our little community association. It never occurred to me that we could go out in the streets of Avoca Beach and ask people with a camera, what do you want the community association to do? I thought, why is that? I mean, that is bizarre. It somehow died out. And it's partly because we all have cameras in our pockets now. So it's so ubiquitous and so everywhere that it doesn't seem special anymore. And it doesn't perhaps seem like a tool that we should be using in this way. Because it was so special then, the tool was used with great reverence and great affection and great sort of exploratory intelligence. And somehow we've sort of lost that. Now, I wanted to end with a rather funny, well, I'll tell you one other thing was, I was, as I said, George was a friend, and he would invite me to NYU to show my films, because he was very interested in this business of the filmmaker's relationship with the material, or with the reality. And I suppose this is going to collaborative too. Although very often I felt myself a victim of circumstances. I'd be in a situation like Vietnam, and things would be happening around me and to me, and I felt that I had to tell about that to some extent, because not to do so just seemed to be a misreporting of the experiential event. And so that's how I sort of backed into my own productions a little bit. But then it went to my head somehow, and when I made Waiting for Fidel in Cuba, which was a sort of a strange waiting situation to see Fidel Castro, who never showed up, I became a sort of a major participant on camera and got into even more trouble for that. Although, goodly or badly, Mike Moore is supposed to have been inspired by that to make Roger and Me. So I started something off there. But anyway, going to George's classes in NYU, possibly our discussions about this might have had some effect on the last film that he made, which was called How the Myth Was Made. He wanted to look what Flaherty had done on Arran Island, which was an oblique island, very like Fogo in a way. And Flaherty had gone there and celebrated the harsh life and the ordeal of life there, and made this film called Man of Arran. And George very wanted to sort of set the record straight and go there and find out how had Flaherty worked, and found out that Flaherty had pulled lots of tricks, that in fact he had used real people down, but he had cast them as characters, and that the nuclear family, who's the core of the film, the mother and the father, were not in fact related at all. They were not family. And all sorts of other, he revived shark fishing, which had been done for 200 years, with the optimistic hope that it might bring some income to the people of the island. But George, more in sorrow than in anger, sort of revealed all of these tricks that Flaherty had played, and sort of used himself in the film as part of the confessional thing. Last little mention. Fogo Island today, I discovered a very curious thing, a new challenge for change at the big end of town, upmarket challenge for change. That extraordinary building there, a woman called Zita Cobb, who grew up in one of these villages, went off to the mainland to Ottawa to do a degree in something, I've forgotten what, became a multimillionaire. She got involved in a fiber optics company and sold out her shares for $69 million. She decided to go back to Fogo, where she'd seen her father burn his longboat because there were no cod and he could make no money out of it. And she knew the dire straits of the island, and she has done a challenge for change thing there. She set up a Grameen Bank type situation where low-cost loans are available for the people of Fogo. She's built artist studios for local artists where these wonderful structures, and built this extraordinary hotel that you see, which is directed at people like Bill Gates, because it's $800 a night. And the idea is that apparently it's working. People go to this bleak spot, which is so curious and strange and be wonderful walking, I suppose. And they stay in that wonderful building that you saw in the previous slide. Now, I don't know anything more about her, but the funny thing is, and the reason for the justification for telling you this, guess what's in the hotel? There's a homage to Challenge for Change. And there's a sort of e-library, NFB situation there where you can borrow films. So all these rich people are coming to, and perhaps borrowing films, and perhaps looking at the Children of Fogo, the island film, as they wine and dine under luxurious circumstance. And I thought, isn't that weird? And I'm sure she was inspired by Challenge for Change. I'm sure she knows the whole story of Colin Lowe going there and all the rest of it. Colin died at 85, just at the beginning of this year. All these great people are going. Glad to be still here, by the way. Anyway, so that's the story. Any questions?
Tell us a bit about Waiting for Fidel. I remember you doing that. Andrew, I remember you doing that years and years ago.
Yeah, I did in 70. Yeah. It was a very funny situation. I had made this film, Sad Song of Yellow Skin, about Vietnam. And this millionaire called Jeff Sterling had seen that film. He was very much a libertarian sort of right-winger. But he was bosom buddies with this left-wing populist Newfoundland politician called Joey Smallwood, who had brought many good things to Newfoundland. Probably worked for Fogo Island as well. Anyway, Jeff cooked up the idea that he and Joey would go to Cuba together, and because Joey had met Fidel and had an entree, we would get the groundbreaking interview that would repair relationships between the US and Cuba. What a funny, naive idea. Anyway, so I was seconded to go with them on a week's notice. I found myself in this private jet flying off to Cuba with these two eccentric characters, and I realized on the plane that I will never luck into such a situation again. Such strange characters. They were fighting cats and dogs, even right there, about politics and so on. Joey loved this, Jeff hated this, and so on. And then we get put in this mansion, and the arguments continued. And so I became a sort of peacemaker, and I said to the cameraman, I said, "Am I in the shot?" And he said, "Oh, you're very much in the shot. What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, let's keep going that way." Well, they behaved so outrageously. The arguments were so funny and often silly, but also revealing in a way that whether there was any chance that Fidel would come, his minders came and met us and so on. Whether there was any chance we ever would have met him, I don't know, but it never happened. And I guess at the end I was so glad, because I had this wonderful sort of drama of these three people waiting in this mansion that had used to belong to an American sugar baron, waiting for the man who never came, or for the interview that never came. So people have accused the film of being fiction. It's not fiction at all. It's all just how it happened. But it has a very fictional look to it. Yeah?
Have you ever
I think that's on. You can find it on the NFB site, National Film Board site. You can find it. Waiting for Phil. Most of my films are on the site.
I just want to encourage people to, when they have a question, to ask at the microphone, so that's okay. And maybe what we'll do is move on to the next presentation, then we'll have more time for a Q&A at the end, if that's all right. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. It's really fantastic to be able to learn about a program like Challenge for Change from someone that was actually there and knew a lot of the people that were involved, and we're really lucky. And I now want to introduce Phillip Crawford. Phillip's unconventional approach to filmmaking is exemplified by the unusual awards he's received. These include an AFI award for the concept of a film, a Film Critics Circle of Australia Award for innovative combination of documentary and fiction and arts, and an Arts Justice Fellowship from the New South Wales Law Foundation. These were for his 1999 docudrama Hurt, a collaborative film project that worked with 250 young people from 5 towns in northern New South Wales. Building on his experiences as a youth worker, Phillip's film works are collaborations with people who would never normally be involved in the process of making films. And what he's going to be talking to us today are some of these projects, including Hurt and also Rites of Passage, which screened on the ABC in 2013.
Thank you. Take your spot as well. That seemed to work well.
You need a mic for that. You can have my mic.
Oh no, I'll just sit here then. Alrighty. I'm just gonna talk. I feel like I'm just gonna talk around a few issues that were triggered by sort of talking about participatory and collaboration. So this is a collection of thoughts rather than a sort of a whole reasoned argument. So I might just start by showing you, there's 3 clips that I'd like to show, and they might trigger some more questions for later as well. But the first one's just the trailer for the film Rites of Passage, which was this collaboratively made film or participatory made film with a group of young people in Wollongong. So this is the trailer.
It showed me how to deal with things that are happening, and that I'm not alone. It's not just me that's dealing with these things.
Everything you saw, even though you knew it was acting, it still touched you because you know that it's real stuff that happens every day, and it's stuff that these kids have really lived.
Almost don't know whether, hey, is it a documentary or is it fiction?
I was quite touched by it actually, and I would suggest that anybody who really wants to know what's going on with young people out there should see it, and especially parents.
Okay, so that sets a little bit of the background for that film. I guess my background is I did start in kind of community work and youth work stuff. So I did a film school down in Victoria at the Victorian College of the Arts. Once I'd been the children's community worker for a few years. And then since then, really all of the projects that I've worked on have always been sort of in this area of being interested in the works of making a film and involving people in the process, and whether or not that's got value for the people who are participating, what's the value to them. So and I thought it was really interesting the way Rowena had set up this meeting, the stuff that she'd written about it, because it is very interesting to sort of think about what those words collaboration and participation mean in the context of filmmaking. And as Mike and also Willi, as Willi pointed out, filmmaking is collaborative. So what's the difference? So I kind of took from what we've sort of experimented with over the years and why we've done it. So I'll just try and talk about that. There might be some interesting things that come up for people from that. So thinking about that, we did, like the works that we've produced are a bit strange, a bit different to, the normal films that you see. And so each time when we've had one of these that we've put on, there was a television series that was on SBS called Not at Home Project, and this film Hurt that you heard about, and this one, it's always a bit of a struggle to try and figure out how you convey to a sort of broader audience like what they're in for when they start the film. So rightly or wrongly, I'm going to show you the start of Rites of Passage, the first 2 minutes, which is a bit of insanity, but it does set up this is what we tried to do in order to try and talk about what was different about this film, and it does address some of the things about participation and collaboration. So if you can play that second clip. Call it, Michael. So you say the numbers at the top, whatever they are. Numbers at the top. Yeah, like shot 1, whatever it is. Roll, frame, 14, second. Action.
Hello.
Okay.
Rolling.
28, short, take 1.
Frame.
Well, I'm meant to be acting, feeling excited. Feeling excited. Feeling excited.
So what am I saying?
Whatever you reckon.
But I do think about...
Spot this spot. Just go back to that spot again for me and cut.
1.
And then, hang on. You got to wait till I say action.
Oh, say it.
Oh yeah.
You can say cut.
Cut.
Don't go on the shot.
You're not even...
Move your head,
You're filming,
dumb.
you dickhead. Yeah, don't look at the cameras. Don't look at the cameras.
Say frame.
Frame.
Action.
Action.
I say that.
Oh, we can't do everything at once. It's trying to be film stars, eh, Phil?
So, what point of view have you written the story from?
I don't know.
Is it first person, second person, third person?
All right. So that is the sort of very long setup, but anyway. But it does talk about, some of the ways, some of the things that we've done that are participatory or collaborative, or you'd certainly get the impression of it as well, listening to what was actually behind the scenes of what we were doing when we were making the film. So anyway, the money to make those works, all of the works that I talked to you about, including this one, has come from sources that are, where the people are more interested. They're interested in the film, but they're probably more interested in what are the outcomes for the people who are involved in the process. So that's why the gist of that sort of the opening one of those principles in there, that really is the thing that's guided all of the projects that we've been working on, which is that somehow or other being involved in the process enables some opportunity for change for the people who are involved in it. And I guess... so that's really a pretty simple idea, and that kind of participation, which could mean being in it, we always kind of define it as helping to make it as well, like getting people to be hands-on with the camera and everything else. That's fairly practical reason, is because sometimes people freak out at the beginning and go, I don't want to be in it, but they'll help to do something else. So it's like a way into the process. Or if you feel like I don't want to be in front of the whole thing, then I've still got a role. So it's a way of being inclusive. Yeah, I kind of go, like, in a sense though, you could still do, yeah, and why do that? It's just because when people get involved, it does create the opportunities for new connections. They make connections with people. They'll have a sense of achievement. They make new networks. They feel like they've got new capabilities. In some cases, they do have new capabilities because they've learnt skills to do with new media or computers or, using cameras, a whole lot of things. But yeah, why would it be important to be collaborative in that kind of setting? I kind of feel like for us, it does mean, because it does create kind of more opportunities again. It would be quite, yeah, so we're always kind of conscious of trying to move away from this is a film by Phil Crawford or by some other filmmaker, that's part of the process. Not only does it not work in a way to just have, because it's certainly not a process it's about having written a script and then casting a whole lot of people or whatever. So there's a highly collaboratively chaotic kind of thing that happens. But also that in the end, the real opportunity in a way, for a lot of the opportunity for change for people that could happen out of such a project is when it's finished. So you don't kind of want to have, this is actually quite rare for me to kind of get up and be the person who talks about this film, because most of the time I don't do it. It's the people who are in the film do all of the talking about it. But that's because it's just another opportunity for them to be, to have opportunities to speak or to be heard and to be seen in different contexts. So even when we got, like, you saw the Warsaw Film Festival thing there, so that was pretty exciting. That was our biggest film festival that we kind of got into. But so one of the girls, a 19-year-old girl from the local public housing estate, she's the one who went. So she travelled over to Poland by herself on a plane and went to the screenings at the Warsaw Film Festival and ran the Q&As, which was, of course, like an incredible opportunity, for change for her. But practically, some of the things that happen though, like certainly it hasn't meant for us that collaboration and participation doesn't mean like it's all just part of a kind of democratic process or it's all not done by consensus. And I guess if any of you have seen any of these works, you figure that out pretty quickly. There are sort of heavily directorial decisions that get made, and part of that is seeking to, if there's opportunity in the making of the film, part of that is facilitating that the other people will see it. You could just make a project and just show it to the people who are in it, and that would be fun. But there's an additional opportunity that they will get if the audience is kind of bigger, and the audience is people who they wouldn't have thought would be interested in their lives. It's not just their family and friends. So part of the directorial decisions or the team-making decisions are, how do we engage with somebody else? But I do think, though, one of the things that's really occurred to me about working in these sort of collaborative projects probably happened, like really crystallised for me on Rites of Passage, is that, we talk, like most often in filmmaking, we talk about, the most fundamental question is, who is the audience for your film? And it's very strong to me now that the first audience for this film are the people who are in it. And so, and I think about it that way because the decisions that we make, that you would normally make on a film work, we make them in different ways. Like, so all the works that I've done have all been multi-character narratives. So why do I do that? Not because I think that that's better for the audience. It's because it's better for the people in it. If there's lots of main characters, then you're sharing the love of being a main character more broadly amongst everybody. If you might have noticed in the trailer and in the other thing, there's quite a few out of focus shots. That's because everybody has a go at being using the cameras and what have you. So we're sacrificing some things that on normal occasions you might not want to sacrifice, but for us, the participation factor is a higher priority. So we're still then struggling to try and, that our first audience has a certain set of constraints, and then trying to find a way to make that work for a broader audience as well, because that's good for them as well. One of the things that I think that wasn't mentioned in there, sort of related to this, didn't figure as one of those little principles, but it was probably the most important one, is that for us we don't have, there are no casting decisions that can involve rejections. Because if you think about it, like even if you're making a documentary or you're making a fiction, there's the finding of the story and then honing it, like going for, well, what's that story and who's that person and how do I follow that? Or if you're doing a drama, it's writing a tight script and then getting all the things to work in place. So for us in this sort of collaboration, we're doing something where we go, if you've come into the process because you're somebody who's maybe been referred from a counsellor or something else, we got to find something for you to do. So we've got to find something that you're good at to put you in the film. So it doesn't work the other way around. It does mean that I think, in these kind of works, they try not to apply too much of, I think what Willi was talking about as well, not too much of that, trying to make it look like it's all organised, like not trying to make it look like it's too much like we're trying to pretend like we had a really good script. So you kind of abandon some of those things, which is part of the reason for a bit of that, I don't know, the chaotic look of the film as well. It's telling you, like helping to tell you what you're going to get. You're getting something different. You're not getting something that's just trying to be like everything else. One other thing quickly to just say about these works, because it's maybe a question that comes up by showing them at a doco thing, because Rites of Passage, we've sort of pitched it as a drama, and quite a few of these works have sort of bordered between documentary and fiction, and that is that we did certainly in some of the early projects, they're much more documentary-ish. We've sort of moved away from it more as we've gone on, and probably because we are also quite interested in, I don't know, the decisions that, how do we create a sort of level of protection around the people who are participating. So when we did the docos, especially with teenagers maybe, and like come 10 years later, I know quite recently we got Not at Home project sort of came back, the copyright came back to us, and I put it to some of the people who'd been involved, do they want to put it online? And a couple of them said no, because they didn't want what they'd said back then to be the first thing that people would search when they search them. I went, that's a really good decision that you're making. I was very lucky that I could that we were able to make that decision. So sometimes this work also does create these, complications with how do you get film support money because of the copyright things and the way that people need to distribute. But did you have a question that you want to ask me now?
What about releases, like performer releases and all that sort of stuff, which... Yeah, lots of things. It's very, very, very interesting what you're saying. I've been involved with lots of groups through my life, like the Sydney Filmmakers Co-op, Melbourne Filmmakers Co-op, cooperatives and things, but always one person sort of rises to the point of running the show. And I think in a way, I'm often that person in my own scene, and you sound as if you are in yours too, and yet you're trying desperately to sort of level it out. So I've got a lot of questions, but very interesting.
Yes, releases we do fairly conventionally, I guess. Like everybody signs a release form. They sign it in that sort of standard way, so it just does give permission to be in the film, and they agreed on Rites of Passage not to get any remuneration from it. So it was like we'll do it when we won't get paid. Insurance is just, we'd only have public liability, because so the people who work on so we don't have to have any of that other sort of film insurance, because the funding for the projects is more about the social outcomes in a way, more than the normal things that might be under pressure. Like, it would be terrible if we lost all the footage, but we'd probably just have to find a way around it rather than having all that. Is that what you meant by what's the insurances?
I was wondering, like, if you film a documentary, you don't have to insure your actor, but that's not really a documentary. So if they do something and get hurt,
yeah,
while you're filming them,
Yeah, no. Well, it's sort of covered by public liability, by the public liability insurance that we have to run activities. But it would be, you could look at it more like we're like an after-school program, but we do filmmaking stuff rather than it having the same implications of a film.
What I might do now is just, if we, instead of taking another question right at this moment, let's just bring up Liz. And then we can, if everyone would like to sit and we can have an open Q&A, that might be a good way. Thank you so much, Phillip. So I want to introduce Liz Thompson, who has been a producer of media for over 2 decades, creating stories for radio, television, and the print media, often in collaboration with Indigenous and marginalized communities. Liz is here to talk about her work with the Sharing Stories Foundation and with the Sharing Stories Digital Online project, which grew out of a desire to facilitate a self-representational process in which the tools are handed over and young people are able to tell their own stories. And so I'll pass it over to you. Thank
you. Hi. So I'll start off with, I thought I brought this along because it's a very big book made with the Nyikinamanggala community in Jalmadanga in the Kimberley. And this is a series of 14 books that I worked on probably around 10 years ago now. They're all all the text is the community speaking for themselves, but then all of the artwork is made by the kids. So I worked with the kids and they made these fantastic series of paintings to illustrate the story that was shared with them, and the story was shared with them on country. So the whole practice was about returning young people to country with elders for the purpose of intergenerational transmission, and elders choosing stories that they wanted to work to hold for the future in these books and to share them with the broader public. And whilst making this book, Annie, who you probably can't see, but there's a photo of her at the back here, asked me if I could help in some way to enable the young people in her community's capacity to produce representations of themselves and to support cultural maintenance practices. So basically, she asked me to develop a program and raise some funding that would skill up the young people to utilise digital media, and the reasons that she said she wanted that to happen were so that the kids in her community could culturally participate in the digital media space, that they weren't left behind in the digital revolution for every child, and that they could produce representations of themselves and the community that were celebratory, rich, vital, vibrant representations that talked about many of the wonderful, positive things that were happening in communities, and that those were part of rupturing the mainstream media narrative of relentless dysfunction. And Annie didn't express it in that way, but basically she was very upset about the images of her community and Indigenous communities generally that were having so much impact in the media. So out of that grew this concept. We raised some funds and we began to run a very simple digital storytelling program, which is really not so much about collaboration, I guess, in the sense that we've talked about it a bit tonight, but I see more as a facilitation. So what we're really doing is passing skills onto communities, but providing some guidance and some structure to the process of creating media. And so we went back into Jalmadanga, we run some programs there, but the other sort of pivotal thing for us, and when I say us, I later set up an organisation called Sharing Stories Foundation, was that the practices that we were transferring were somehow going to become self-sustaining. And we were running a lot of these programs in schools, and the reasons that we were running them in schools was because there was a lot of technology there, there was a place that the kids came every day, and what we wanted to work on was bringing culturally relevant learning into the school environment and into the educational space. And So there were a whole lot of levels in which we were sort of endeavouring to make this practice work in a sustainable way. For example, we were working in Jilkming in a small community near Katherine. The community live on the Roper River and call themselves Piccaninny Belong Roper, the children of the Roper River. And we would work with the teachers to try and have the digital storytelling practice supporting a theme that was being studied at school in that particular semester. So, for instance, the teacher at that time said, OK, we're doing rivers. And we said, well, what about rivers are you doing? Well, we're going to look at the Ganges and the Mississippi. So we said, well, how about? And we got, two of the senior cultural custodians who wanted to be involved, who I'd had long-standing relationships with because we'd made a book several years earlier. And we took up a whole new approach to that unit where we went out with those elders onto country with the young people who recorded songs with those custodians relating to how the river came into being, who recorded and created stories about the bush tucker that was found in and around the river, the recreational activities that occurred around the river, language relevant to the river. And so at the end of that 2-week period, the elders had come into the classroom had been taken out onto country, the kids had really got their head around using a whole lot of new media to record stories that were valued on country with elders who felt that they were recognised for the knowledge that they held, the relationships between the community and the teachers were strengthened, and the outcomes were part of an important cultural maintenance practice. In addition, when communities determine that some of that media is something that they would like to share in the public domain, some of that media, we then facilitated a process where Education Services Australia, who write metadata to match resources with, now the Aboriginal Torres Strait Island perspectives across curriculum priority area, so that these young people are telling stories about their life, their culture, their stories and things that matter to them, and it's their stories and their voices that are then accessed in the educational space that other children are coming to and learning about their lives and experiences and so forth. So I just want to show you a 5-minute clip which is a map which drops into various places in which we work and communities with whom we work, with tiny vignettes out of pieces of media that those children have made. And I want you to be mindful when you watch it that all of this stuff is made by kids. They're the ones who film it, photograph it, they think about the sounds that are required, record the sounds, they work with GarageBand to mix those sounds. So everything that you see here, including conceptualising, is made by kids usually between the age of about 10 and 17. So can I just ask you to skip the number 1 film because of time and just go straight to number 2? Please.
Hey!
My name is Winston Shoveler. These photos you are looking at are of my family. I'm really proud of my family for fighting for our people, for having the courage to continue on with our traditional culture and language.
My name is Chuan and I got a black-headed neck paint on my face because this is my turtle.
Hi, my name is I live at Alco Island. My totem is an emu and a coconut tree.
I recorded my uncle Jonga. He told me the story about the Jilpan and the water moon man on the canoe. And the Jilpan is the stars.
Ma nal chani ka ding king ja na ding ka barai ding tao pai chawi
The story of Emu Dreaming starts at Emu Springs outside Canara. She went through the odd bush to Red Lily Springs with her Nandanandas. There were 10 of them.
Come on, Kawajala. Let's go in the sunrise.
It's too hot. We're gonna die.
Give me a dreaming. Give me a dreaming.
The children have been painting a mural on the school wall. Manyalok has a frog dream inside one case from the community, and it's been that symbol of the community, you know.
Dad, man up and glove and lang a hill. Look, that frog, picture lang a frog.
I know we got different ways and means of expressing ourselves. There are many ways and means we can get our stories out there. I think it's very vital and important to preserve and record these stories. We see, we live and breathe and see the creatures that are depicted in these stories, and that is very important.
I am an Adjamatna person from the Flinders Ranges. I'm going to tell you a story about Yulu's Col. It's part of our Yuramura. The serpents began to make a big whirlwind. Everybody ran this way and that, trying to escape, but the serpents were just too fast, and they ate everybody. Their bodies formed to the walls of Wilpina Pound.
We made glue out of flour, sugar and water. So I could stick the photos on. The street looked awesome. Yeah.
It shows people that we're proud people, understand? And it's good to see all smile and happy faces, because when people walk through you, all they see is doom and gloom by the outlook of the town, but it shows people that there's happiness here and there's good people here.
It's a story about the Ngati and the paddle steamer, about how a paddle steamer came to end up in the bottom of the river at the steamer's point here. And these three special people, they were called Mekika. Mekika, that's the clever people.
So that last piece is interesting because that was made with Barkindji students, the students at Wilcannia Central School, and we were able to tag it to a history class because the Barkindji perspective on the sinking of the cotton steamer was that the Nyachi, the serpent in the bottom of the river, was annoyed by the noise of the steamer going back and forth, but the European perspective is just that it sank. So, it was really great to be able to have the kids get involved in this story, sit out on country with Uncle Murray Butcher, listen to the story, learn about how to use all of those digital media techniques, and then produce this output that can then be used ongoingly as a teaching and learning resource. The other thing I want to show you, I have to step over here now, and do I have a mic over here, or can you hear me? Is some work that we've been doing. Some work that we've been doing recently, at the request of community, to turn these multi-touch books, these print books, into interactive multi-touch books. So again, elders and Annie engaged in discussion about this, wanting to produce versions of the book that kids, they're on their technology all the time, they're on their phones, they're on tablets and they're on iPads and so forth. So can we make something that the kids are going to want to interact with on their tablets? So we've been going back into the communities who were involved in making the original books, and in fact we're lucky enough recently to get funding from the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation to start work with those 5 Victorian communities that you just saw on the map there. And so we've been working with them to turn, well, not to turn because there weren't pre-existing books, but to create 5 new books. But I want to show you this first. So in the new interactive versions of this book, in discussion with the custodians, there was a desire to have the story made available to young people in the land to which it belonged and where the story lives. And so we don't have the full funding for this functionality at the moment, but this is just an example. Annie, the lady who I spoke to you about, who's actually coming to Sydney this weekend, in this book started to draw all of the different and important sites that Wunyambu travelled to as he travelled through this country and ultimately brought the Fitzroy River into being. And when we have the capacity, this map will function so that, if I can just find my cursor, oh, there it is. You'll be able to click on the icons and they will move you across the country. And the song that Wunyambu sang in that next particular place will become available, and the children interacting with this book will be able to listen to the songs that Wunyambu laid down and left behind in the particular geographic locations that the map that Annie produces will identify. Then you can move into the books, and of course, English, you know, the story was told in Nyikina. So these books will ultimately be bilingual again when we can raise some more funding to make that manifest, so that kids can move in between English and language. The story will be able to be heard in both English and language. And you will also be able to, sorry, I'm flicking backwards and forwards, but listen to the songs.
Walked a long way back to...
Sorry, that's not what I wanted to play you. I wanted to show you this function.
Jajarba wanga main, jajarba wanga main, jajarba wanga main, jajarba wanga, and jajarba wanga main, balawadan jajarba wanga main, balawadan jajarba wanga main, jajarba wanga main, jajarba wanga main, jajarba wanga.
So children will be able to listen to the particular songs that Wunyambu laid down at particular points in the story. And I do want to add that when we went back to make this book, this book is 12 pages long, 12 pages of story. And in the process of, again, returning children to country with elders visiting important sites, Annie and Daraga, who you just heard singing there, added 12 pages to this book of story that wasn't story that was necessarily withheld in the first instance, but of course relationships of trust are developed and so more is brought forward, but were actually remembered in some instances as old people sat down on country and reflected and recalled and country spoke to them. So this book then became 24 pages, which freaked the facilitators out a little bit, but they did an unbelievable job. And so, for example, this animation that the kids made, we took them to this site, and it's a spot where there was a ceremony, and the Wunyambu told the Broga that he was going to be the Yidaki player, and the Pelican that he was going to be the Yidaki player, and the Broga that he was going to be the songman. And there was a hole in that rock platform when we took the kids there, and they all got down on their hands and knees and blew into the hole, you know, which was the Yidaki that the Pelican had played during the ceremony. And then they went back to school and they made this animation.
Koraga, Indiana Koraga, Mabuk Uncle Joa, Joanne Warabonolo. Mayara, Indiana, Joaga, Digital Jangadawale. Palinjara Indiana, Joa Marlanyajao, Yingama Bera, Yogo Bush. Indiana Midamale, Joa Yingama Bera, Marlanyajago Joa, Yoko Desert.
So this is Wunyambu telling particular animals where they belong, and there's so many fantastic, I'd love to show you more of these. I'll just show you the beginning of this. So you get some sense, the kids are working with green screen, they're working with After Effects, they're working with drawing tablets, and they're really engaged. I mean, they won't leave when the bell goes and it's time to go out for a break. But I'm just going to show you, I won't show you the whole clip, but so you get a sense of the different techniques that they're learning. So this is when Wunyambu was bringing everything into being.
Malambugada, Yadabungani, Malambugada, Yadabungani, Ganvada, Urlimbo, Ganvada, Urlimbo, Malambugada, Yadabungani, Malambugada, Yadabungani. Jamangola, 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 Jamangola.
I'd love to play you all of them, but I'm aware of a time restraint. I do want to just play you this one because I think it's gorgeous and it's got a lovely story. So Wunyambu used a malgadin, a paperbark pillow, and Annie really wanted to take the children out onto country and teach them how to cut that pillow from the tree and how Wunyambu rolled it, and for them to have the experience of that. So we all went out onto country and Annie cut every child a paperbark pillow from the paperbark tree, rolled them up, and the little kids, like years 2 to 4, lay down on their pillows and Annie sang to them the Malgadin song that Wunyambu left behind relating to these pillows. And then they went back to school and they made this little animation, which I think is really beautiful. So at the moment, these books are community level books. So they're made by community, for community, they stay in community, they're a teaching and learning resource. We have just secured a little bit more funding, which will allow us to go back to ensure that we can work with community language workers, and we can work with community to create the interactive maps and so forth. And we will then discuss whether community, in some instances, might want to release those books, for example, onto iTunes U, make them available for sale, what they want to charge for them and all that sort of stuff, but it's not actually part of what we're doing at the moment. This practice at the moment is very much a community-driven practice that's owned and controlled by a community. And I want to just show you one final clip because I feel like it would be great for you to actually see the kids making the work, and then I'm done. So if you could just play that last clip, that would be great. Maybe I have to get out of there.
My name's Rick Nelson. I'm Brian's son. I'm a descendant of the Jara people, the Jara people who spoke the Jar Jar Wurrung language. We're from central Victoria or the Upper Loddon Valley.
My name's Zeppelin, and I go to the meeting place which is for Indigenous kids. We got to make this really fun bite book. It was about Bunjil the eagle.
This is the story of Bunjil the eagle that my father told at this school a couple of years ago, and now we're going to reproduce it, if you like, into a second version, and we want some of you guys to help us work on that. He fell into the fire. That's when he turned black. But Crow also learnt the secret of making fire.
With Lindsay, I learnt how to make all the pictures because we would have 3 pictures. One would be the frame of it, and then we would cut out other bits from it, and there would be this art, and you would capture a picture.
How cool is that? That's pretty cool. Wow.
It's been really amazing watching the children participate, recording our own sounds, rolling rocks, hitting various pieces of material to get some of the sounds. They're really ecstatic about it and hugely into it.
While I found the fire, that was me going, rah! How we made the lightning strike and that while we used these, we flipped the table over and we got these blocks and we fall down.
Some of the children will be back soon and you can talk to them, but it has given them something that they own as Indigenous kids. And for Indigenous kids, that's pretty hard these days. I saw kids that are very hard to engage, just sitting there listening.
I'm really interested in learning about technology and making artworks. It's a great way to learn about our stories and to entertain people.
The things I learnt from this amazing experience was how to play around with all kinds of different sounds. I also nearly learned to touch type by doing a lot of captions from the pictures I took at Mount Franklin.
I was really impacted by what Auntie Trish was saying about going from the darkness to light, about your own identity. As an adult, that has been a big journey. So, sorry, I get a bit emotional, but it was really special having my daughter Grace come up here and talk openly about her culture and who she is. Yeah, was a part of the healing process with being with Casno and Bendigo working so well together, and there should be a lot more of that, because we're all like the same community and we all want the same things for our kids.
My little girl has been part of this, and to look in here yesterday and see her sitting with Uncle Rick, it actually brought a tear to my eyes.
I'm proud to be Indigenous. I want to share our dream time stories.
So we've got ancest or.
So see guys, they might be sharpening their axes here, making medicine. To keep those stories alive and going and ongoing and teaching them to the kids is very important. Now they point out Bunjil the eagle flying, as they're driving along or walking along and pointing it out to some of their parents. Some of the culture has been lost already, particularly here in Victoria. Now the kids can be interactive with IT, the technology age. We can put it around various institutes with the iPads, and that's the way we've got to head to keep the culture alive.
Maybe I'll invite everyone up and we can open things up for questions. But I might start with a question. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and speaking and sharing about your work and reflecting on what it means to collaborate and make media with people. I'm just wondering if there are sort of models or mentors that you've drawn on in your own work as you've developed collaborative or participatory projects of various kinds, and what that might be.
No, I wouldn't say. I mean, my teachers are the cultural custodians, really, with who we work and who pretty much determine how the process is going to roll. I wouldn't say that that we have followed a model. I think that we've just worked it out as we've moved along in response to the things that have arisen and the request to community. I mean, certainly we've learnt things. Anyway, that's my response, that there's not a particular mentor or model that we've followed. But
in terms of did work on the Hurt project and Not at Home project with a company called Big Art, and the artistic director of that company is a guy named Scott Rankin, and he, in a sense, he's a theatre maker, but so in working with film, I was definitely shaped by trying to adapt those sort of ideas of the community work that he'd done into using film. And I think probably, I do think quite a lot about when working with people to get good performances out of them when they're not experienced actors. So I've always been interested in people who do that. So, filmmakers like Ken Loach and what have you. I'm really fascinated by the way that those directors work. So.
I think I learned very early on by trial and error that unless you are extremely attentive to how people that you're working are feeling, then you'll get very nasty surprises, because when you're working in documentary, there's no money relationship with people, and they can walk away at any moment if they want to. So you have to know how they're feeling about the situation, because you know what you are doing and hoping to get, but what are they getting? And you have to be very aware of that all the time, and thinking about it. And it's happened to me a couple of times that people have just sort of walked off, and I realized later the signs were all there. If I'd been more attentive, I would have seen it coming and could have prevented it happening, perhaps.
Well, Mike, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the film that you made in 2004 called All About Olive, which sounds like it was a film that was very much a collaboration between you and the principal subject, but she became a co-director.
Olive was 104 at the time, and I had been interested in the fact that people are living much longer than before, and the original idea was more of an essay film on exploring why that was. And but then when we started researching it, we came across this one woman, Olive Riley, who had been a barmaid most of her life, and nobody had paid any attention to her, or she didn't feel herself to be in any way special, but she'd arrived at this point of life where she was very, very special. And she decided that she wanted to go back to Broken Hill, where she'd been born. And so the natural structure of the film became her journey back. And the amusing and touching part of it was that we were delving her past through her memories, and we were doing some simple recreations of situations. But since I didn't have the funds or the inclination to do these at a very high level of historic recreation, it seemed much better to have Olive as part of the recreation, commenting on it. And so she sort of took over and really kept on correcting my perception of how it might have been. And it's both funny and touching, and thereby I thought, well, Olive has done this as much as I have, so I'll give her a co-direction credit. And no, it was a very, very lovely film to make, and it just, personally, it made me think that we have these expectations of how long life may go on, how long one might live, and then suddenly you meet somebody like this who's functioning, enjoying herself at such a great age, and it sets your own goalposts way back, and you think, oh, I will live to the full, much more. Because my parents had both died young, in their 50s and 60s, and when that happened, and when I approached their death date and passed it, I thought, well, that's it, I'm pretty much gone now. But then when I met Oliver and made the film, I changed my whole way of thinking.
I have another question, which is, Phillip, a number of your films have been broadcast on ABC and SBS, or the films that you've been part of facilitating. And I'm just wondering at what point in the process that happened, whether that was always something that your projects were intended for, or whether it was something that emerged, and what the dynamic was in that respect.
Yeah. The first one was Hurt, and so it was completely made and edited, and then SBS bought it for $5,000 or whatever it was that they paid back in those days. So it was a 52-minute film. That did lead to, when we made the TV series, Not a Home Project, that did get post-production funding. So all of the project was funded just by the sort of philanthropic and arts foundation-y kind of money. And then SBS, AFC at the time, and FTO put in money to this post-production kind of thing. I have to say, like, the reality is that was not very compatible with the community collaboration thing, because it was quite a big project, perhaps a bit too big for its own boots, in that, yeah, it was spread. There were people all across Australia who contributed to this documentary series. But we finished it, so some of them started working on it in 2000, in the year 2000, maybe at the end of 2000. And so we did all of the sort of filming work over about 2 or 3 years in different communities. And then SBS didn't screen it till 2006. And by that stage, everybody was retired. You know what I'm saying? So it was like we lost control of that element. We weren't allowed to screen it anywhere else, well, that kind of bullshit. So I kind of went after that. With Rites of Passage, we didn't even consider. We crowdfunded for the post-production and did reasonably well with that, but there was no way that I was going to try and secure any of that kind of money that has those sort of obligations, because in the end, I have to say even the film festivals are a pain in the ass because of all that, They want you to screen it here first. And in the end, we didn't get into any Australian film festivals, and I was kind of glad about it in the end, because it meant I didn't have any hold-offs, The whole process at the end for us was about each one of all the young people involved, or the principal ones, they all got to travel on a plane somewhere. Some of them said things like, do I need different money when I go to Melbourne? Like they'd never been outside the place where they live. They got to go somewhere, they got to run a screening, at Acme or some cinema in Perth. But if I have all those other obligations, it's just like we're just limited. So it was much more, in the end, yeah, the thing with getting on the ABC was, it was finished in 2013, and it was not till a year and a half later that it screened on the ABC. So it was just like a bit of icing on the cake. The young people loved it. But
maybe I'll open it up to see if there are any questions from the audience. And if people do have questions, if they would like to go to the microphone.
I've got a question. Can I ask him over here? Far over there. I'm just interested. I suppose in making a film in a community, really, you don't just want to leave behind a film. You want to leave behind filmmakers. That to me is a true collaborative process. But then, of course, there's also the question. That's one statement rather than just a question about process. But it's about process. But then there's also the question about archive, and when you have a big archive of community-based material, what happens to that, and how does the community get access to that in a meaningful kind of way? So just two process-based questions. Or statements.
Do you want to go?
Well, with the media that we work on facilitating, that stays in community on hard drives, or in the instance of the multi-touch books on iPads, and sometimes we budget to purchase iPads. Would be great to get sponsorship with that kind of stuff, but to leave iPads in the community. And then we have, big drives that we keep it on as well. So, or if there's cultural centre in the community, it'll stay there as well. It really depends on what's available in the community and how it's going to be held in safekeeping, but also these multi-touch books, the individual films we were able to give people on USBs, and they watch them on the TV and, have them on phones and all that sort of thing. And in fact, it's not really related to the question, but the individual animations were stitched together, and so that communities also had like a 10-minute film, which is also held there and shown at things like the Remote National Indigenous Media Festival or ICTV or that kind of thing. Does that answer your question? Sort of.
I think that leaving the skills is a good point. What I've found over the years of doing the sort of participatory, collaboratively stuff that we do is that it's been mostly with young people and not in a school context. So, like, we're working with them outside of school hours and what have you, which I don't know whether you've probably done that as well. I find that then the ones who... There's a small group of people who ever get interested in the editing or can tolerate it for more than about 10 minutes. Same with anyone, exactly. So, so out of the mob who were involved in rites of passage, there were 10 of them made their own short film, sort of as part of the process. They wrote and directed their own piece. So they were the ones who had that was sort of facilitated through the project. So 3 or 4 of them studied then digital screen and media. One's kind of working several of them are working a set of projects. They're doing like their own little social enterprise thing now, like they're running, videos for Mission Australia and what have you. So making content for people, which is a great experience for them. But it's not, I would say it's not for everyone. And in terms of the content from our point of view, again, I think that's important. We've got a lot of rushes, but it's a whole lot of drama rushes. I'm not sure that anybody really wants that. In terms of the content being available to the people who've made it, though, that's pretty important. And again, that was why the screening on SBS became problematic, because people lost the control of being able to decide when they wanted to screen it themselves, really.
This work has affected you, like what you've learnt from it and how it's changed your practice, and what you've learnt from working with your participants and how it's reflected back on how you may have changed your practice over the years, because you've been doing it, you've all been doing it for a number of years, but I guess particularly Phillip and Mike, how your practice has changed over the years as a result of what's come back to you.
I don't know that I have really changed that much. I think, you remember Marshall McLuhan had a famous phrase, the medium is the message. I like to twist that around and say the process is the product. That the doing is really, for me, what it's very much about. And especially, I'm just publishing a book on my painting, actually, because at the same time I've been making films, I've been doing art all my life, and I've never really paid attention as to what that added up to. And I realised that all that artwork is storytelling with people, and very often the picture that resulted was not nearly as important as the interaction with the people at the moment and around the doing of it. And I usually gave them away or left them in places and so on. But I've always been that way, in a sense. I haven't really revered the product that much. And I still, I don't think I've changed that much, really.
I had a experience a little bit like what Mike was talking about like a co-director. So when we were making Hurt, I met a fella named Matthew Priestley in Moree, so an Indigenous man who, we just went there and he just had a story. Like, he had a story he wanted to tell. So our role became supporting him. Like, he was not a filmmaker, so I became more like a I don't know, a sort of experienced cinematographer or something or other, so helping to go, here's how we might shoot this and what have you. What I learnt from him, though, was completely invaluable because of I think it does have quite a lot to do with the storytelling tradition that his Indigenous heritage brought him. And I don't know, but it was so flexible, you know, so like, because all of the usual obstacles in making a film where I would just be completely thrown, you know, like, and working the way that we do, nothing goes to plan. Absolutely nothing. People don't want to do it that day. They don't turn up. They cut their hair yesterday. They lose their costume, you know, like, so everything that goes wrong will go wrong. And he just would go, like, he would just go straight away as soon as something or other, someone, you know, oh, Nan doesn't want to do it today. He'd just go, okay, well, what we're doing is this. And he just changed the story. So as soon as an obstacle came up, it was just the next impetus to change the story direction in this direction. And I'm so glad that I met him to learn that, because that's what I do all the time now. Like, I'm just not freaked out by those things. I just go, right, so how, like, what do I do? Where do we go now? From the people who we've often worked with who experience hardship and different kinds of disadvantage, and their stories are kind of involved. Like, it's just, I've always, like, from my community work, I don't find that at all depressing. I find it very inspiring, because I think that's what really interests me, is when we're all faced with the things that we don't think we can handle, what we do then is really it's about to be alive. So I find that quite inspiring, and so I'm constantly inspired.
I have made several documentaries, but I'm working more in terms of creative practice as a photographer. I think has always been my passion, and so I have learnt from the processes that I've shared with you tonight in the context of photography, because I take all of my photographs back. A lot of my photographs are, you know, produced in the context of Indigenous community, because that's where I work, and I take all of the photographs back. I have a book of photography coming out next year with Magabala, but all of the text is written by the people who feature in the photographs. So they've looked at the photographs I've taken and told me what they want to say about them. And that's just been a fantastic experience for me, because there's so many incredible, wondrous things that manifest in those conversations, and things that people see in those photographs that I didn't necessarily see, and certainly wouldn't have written into and around those images. So that's been fantastic. And in terms of the narrative, I had a show last year, a collaborative show in Canberra, and a senior cultural custodian came down from Arnhem Land. We'd filmed and photographed with his community for 3 weeks following the muka, the giant green sea turtle hunter's journey through the Wessel Islands. And I was showing a series of my photographs and recordings he'd made of Song Cycle and so on and so forth, and we laid the photos out. And he said, okay, that you got to take that one out and put this one in. And I said, oh, but that's not a good photo, you know. And he said, it doesn't matter whether it's a good photo. It matters that the sequence of the photos is correct. And of course, you know, absolutely. And so, but then we have this interesting conversation about, well, also it's about aesthetic and what pictures work and how I feel as a photographer. And I mean, of course, the narrative was as he determined, but a really stimulating conversation and process. And what I love about that is that it surprises me. I love to be surprised in my own sort of creative process and practice. And the other thing I'd say, which isn't really, I suppose, about filmmaking, but the way the work has changed my own relationship with the country in which I'm privileged to live in. You know, the work has just had a profound effect on my own relating to the land, and that's been, you know, something that I'm eternally grateful for, which isn't about film, but it is an outcome of the process.
Yes, the whole the whole issue of intellectual property is something that is of interest from all three of you, how you handle that. I know in my own experience I made a lot of films with David Gopel when he was 17 and 18. They're all... and other people in America took them over and they distributed them through the world, and huge number of, and who owns that property? I don't want to own it, but does David Goldwell want to own it? Should he own it? The whole thing is very interesting and very contentious. So questions, answers.
Well, I think you probably would have a different experience to my own, but the IP and copyright in the material remains with the communities that have produced it. As an organisation, we might have a licence with the community to show or distribute that material, but always on a consultative basis. So that's how we work with this particular content. But
yeah, it's like an ongoing mystery. So we've tried various things. So when we did Hurt, the release was very basic. I'm happy to be in the film, but we did have it back in because we went to make a feature-length drama and came back with a 52-minute documentary, docudrama. I don't know. But we went with that sort of idea of doing a sort of deferred payment. So if it ever made money, then the people who didn't get paid would get paid a percentage out of the thing. So there was an elaborate system, which it did make the money from SBS. So that meant that I went around northern New South Wales and paid different people there between $4 up to about $160, which was a pretty hilarious thing to do. And then with Not at Home project, we also had, we trialled when we were doing that a sort of similar thing, but also when somebody told their story, their piece of their own life, which was about being not at home, we said that made them script writer, in our conception they were script writers. So we contracted them like you would in the chain of title to be script writers. And again, that had a deferred payment sort of thing, it was just a nightmare because of the length of time, then trying to find all these people, and be in touch with them was just crazy.
Thank you, that was great.
No worries.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. With Rites of Passage, we just decided to go, just to make it simpler. And so we just it was more like a standard release, which says the copyright in the material is held by the not-for-profit company. I think that there was a clause in there that said that there was the understanding from the point of view of the people who were participating in the project that if it made any money, that money would be put into other projects to give other people a similar opportunity. When it did make money from the ABC, the board just said, you give that back to those young people. So that's what happened. So even though it was not contracted, that's what the company did. We've probably made... various of the young people, especially in Not at Home project, have asked me at various times for copies of their stuff. I just make a copy of the master tape and send it to them. I'm not sure SBS or the FTO or whatever would necessarily have approved, but I just did it. So.
I don't have much to say except that I've always felt that the people in the film, they own themselves, because when you put yourself in front of a camera, that's an act of nakedness in a way. It's an act of vulnerability, and so I've always felt that before the film went anywhere, the people in the film had to see it, and the implication of what that was that if they didn't like it, then changes would be made. But I've always felt that had to be the way of working, and I've never regretted it.
We'll just have one last question.
I just wanted to add a point to that. When I was a bit younger, I made quite a few collaborative documentary projects, and one of the ones we went on to involved going to a community where, to our surprise, it was with young people, and the young people, they all wanted to make a story basically talking to the older people in the community basically about abuse. And so the film actually, I was thankful that the film actually didn't go anywhere as such. It went exactly where it needed to go, which is straight to those people in the community that the young people needed to speak to. It never got distribution. It just strikes me that actually films don't need to necessarily go anywhere other than to the audience that they're actually made for. Anyway, it's a statement again, but I think it just shows that actually collaborative filmmaking can be really important for just for the function of actually empowering people within a community for their, within the structure and fabric of just this very small community. It doesn't need to be a big distribution operation.
Can I ask Phillip a question? Your list was very interesting at the beginning of the film of the sort of the rules of the game. What about in the editing process? I mean, were there things left out, and were people consulted? You're not going to be on the screen in your scene because we've decided not to use it, sort of thing. Did that happen?
Yes, it did. So that is a tricky one. Like, so I'd say the overall principle is that nobody ends up on the cutting room floor. So look, because that's like, why would that be good for the people involved if they ended up on the cutting room floor? So in fact, that's another reason why that whole 2-minute section is at the beginning of the film. Like, the people who are in those shots, some of them are not anywhere else in the film. So I was going, we don't want to cut them, but where can we use them? So that's where they went. They went right at the beginning. If you put them later, once the narrative engines had started, then it was like suddenly you cut to a shot of a guy jumping off a rock. You go, who's he? Like, what's he related to? But it was fine in the beginning of the film, in the sort of chaotic way. But we did also have, we worked on 10. There were 10 narrative lines, I suppose, when we started working on the film. One just never got shot, really. So it was the shots in the film are the couple with the baby that you saw. So there was a whole narrative around that just never got shot because it was for various reasons. And then there were 4 other sort of narrative lines that in the end got turned into their own short films. So it was a bit chaotic to stick them all together, so they became their own things. Most of those people were pretty happy with that idea. One guy who's still in the main film, so he was still in the main film, but he sort of had a secondary part, and his main sort of section was made its own. I think he felt like it was a slight, so that was sort of hard. But look, I just was honest with him because we said we could keep this in the film, but if we kept it in the rites of passage film, we showed him what it was. Like, it was going to be 3 bits, but when it went into so maybe a minute and a half, and a bit out of context, When it was in its own film, it could be 7 minutes. So it was like much a better representation of what he wanted to work on was to make his own short film. And he also made a separate film. He also directed his own film. So he's sort of interested in that. So I don't think there's any one rule. I can't tell you there's one rule that we did, but certainly it's of concern that all of the time, how do we do this? And probably some of them looked at it and went, I did all this work on all this stuff and it's not there. But anyway.
Right. But were you following just the old-fashioned principle of what is compelling when making your choices in the cut?
Yes, but probably if you were, if a proper editor got their hands on it, they would have cut it very differently to the way it was cut, because they would have made decisions about performances and what have you that they would have gone, that just doesn't work, so we remove it. Whereas I just had to keep on going, no, we've got to make it work. We've just got to make it work. It's got to work. So we just keep working it until it works to the best that we can. Because you can certainly cut it's a good learning experience to go, you shoot a lot of stuff and then it doesn't all end up in there. But it definitely was the case for us that we couldn't just remove somebody. That would just not be in the key.
And you knew that from the beginning, so you bit that bullet right at the top.
Totally, yeah. And I guess, given previous experience, I kind of know that there's ways that you do it. But one of them is to the audience, it's a compromise. But then the whole thing is a compromise.
So that was part of the excitement. In the same way, if a character didn't turn up, you'd turn the story around to accommodate that event.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, the editing. I mean, I really enjoy the editing as well. But it's part of that. It's a real puzzle. It's a real challenge to go. Yeah, how Can you make it work?
Makes it sound more doable than I thought.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, on that note, maybe I would just like to thank you all so much for coming and for sharing your experiences and your insight and for being here. And thank you everyone for coming to OzDox, and we'll see you next time. We hope.